Welcome to the Boomer Woman's Podcast. I'm your host, Agnes Knowles. Sometimes I encounter a subject I know nothing about, like small business exit planning. And sometimes my guest is so well spoken that in editing, I'm thinking I could just delete my part of the conversation. Len's easy, unhesitating answers to the various scenarios I throw at him are testament to how well he knows his stuff. Near the end, Len explains why business owners don't take this on. They think it's complicated, it's expensive, and they don't have time. If you're that business owner, Len's discussion will assure you it's doable and too important to procrastinate about. If you are or know a small business owner, listen now. I'm a woman. I'm a boomer. So of course I know what subjects could be discussed on this podcast. Of course I know what my listeners want. Until I get a message like this. Agnes, I help business owners age 55 plus get ready to transition out of their companies, whether that is in 2 years or 20. ... There is a severe lack of education on the topic of exit planning for small businesses. Well, that's not me. And then I got off my high horse and realized that could well be you. Some of my favorite businesses are owned and operated by people my age-ish. Do they have plans for the business? Sell? Be taken over by family? By a long-term employee? You can't just lock up and walk away after all the sweat equity you've invested. And tomorrow is not guaranteed to any of us. So business owners need to have some sort of plan in place in case that proverbial bus comes around the corner. So if you are or know a business owner age 55 plus, I put that in there, Len, and I realized that any age probably should be listening in. Anyways, I hope I asked some of the right questions of my guest today. Len Bruskiewitz, welcome to the Boomer Woman's Podcast.
Thank you, Agnes. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Yeah, no, this is great. If I read your bio correctly, you've been surrounded by business all your life. Your grandparents, your parents, your own career. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I'm a third generation small business owner on both sides of my family. My grandparents on my mother's side owned a bakery, and my grandparents on my father's side owned a funeral home. And my father ran the funeral home, and my brother continues to run it. So three generations there. And then I've had a pretty long career in the high tech space. I've worked for a lot of companies, some very successful, who focused on small businesses as their customers. So I also got 30 plus years of dealing with small businesses issues and knowing how to deal with them, mostly with technology to help them out.
I did see some of the business names in your profile and I was very impressed. So now in your profile, you say over 3 million of the 6 million companies with 1 to 19 employees in the US are owned by people age 55 plus, and the vast majority of them do not have any kind of transition plan in place. Now, I don't know if you know this, I'm in Canada. I'm sure the percentage is similar in other and Western countries. Why is exit strategy not part of the other plans that go into business planning?
I think there are a couple reasons. The first reason is that when you go to school, when you go to classes, it's all about starting a business. It's
Mm.
about growing a business, but there's no education on the side of planning to exit that business. So I think that's one. There's just a real lack of education in this space. The second part of the answer is nobody really wants to think about it. It's kind of like buying life insurance. Everybody knows they need it, but nobody really wants to think about it. So I think that's another component as to why businesses don't do a better job of planning for their exit. And it is it is a generational thing. There is some information, some data published from a survey by the Exit Planning Institute, surveyed several thousand small business owners in North America. And what they found was the generation 55 and up is actually the least well prepared to exit their businesses. Kind of ironic because they should be the best because they're closest to it in terms of age. The millennials, the younger, the 20 somethings begin businesses, I think, with a shorter time frame. And I think they just think about, I'm going to do this for 4 or 5 years and then I'm going to get out. So they think about it. Whereas I think our generation grew up with this idea and they saw their parents. I saw my parents, I think we saw our parents work at the same job for 40 years and then retire. And that wasn't what happened to our generation, but I think we still model what we saw our parents' generation do. So I think as business owners, we're sitting there saying, we're just going to do this till we keel over, right? Uh, and so that's what leads to this real lack of planning. And it really is, it's staggering. It's something along the lines of only about 15% of the business owners 55 and up actually have a written exit plan in place, which is kind of terrifying. That's the problem I'm trying to solve. I'm in my own little way, trying to get more of those business owners prepared.
Yeah, no, it's so true that the younger generations are looking at much shorter spans in most of the things they do. And I'm all with that, quite honestly. That's all right. Now, could I clarify, first of all, are we talking just brick and mortar here, or are successful.coms in the same boat?
Same boat. It's really it's not an industry by industry problem. It's pretty general. It's over the entire small business population.
Okay. Now,
And I think there are some, I think there are some reasons why, sorry, I'll quickly, there are some reasons why. And I think once you get to that stage, you think, wow, this is really confusing and complicated. And I think that's another reason why you don't address it as the time goes on.
when I started looking at options for business owners, taken over by a child seemed to be the most obvious. And it's funny that you just said keel over because dying in the office came to mind next. What actual options are there for someone to consider?
Sure. Succession to a family member is certainly a viable option. I'd like to come back to that one once I go through the list. So, succession to a family member, selling to a third party is clearly one that comes up quite often. Passing along to employees or management is another pretty viable option. So, those three. Or let's see, another one would be to sell to a competitor or a partner, potentially to one of the partners in the firms. So those are the basic ones. Most of the clients I'm dealing with are never going to go public, right? So uh, getting purchased, the succession, or some kind of employee management sale are the most common options.
Okay, you talked about going back to the family option. I'm going to throw in my question about the family option before you go there. And that was, what if the business owner actually needs the money and the child is expecting just to walk in and take over?
Yeah, that's a common situation. One of the ways that can be structured is you can the child in this case or younger family member can actually go and get a loan to try and part of the pay out the parent if that's a viable option there. So that's probably the most in the situation you described, that's the best alternative. There can also be bringing in a third party as an investor rather than as an owner. Those get pretty tricky though when it is family members involved, right? So the most viable option is that the younger business owner now goes out and gets funding to pay out the parent.
Right. In my mind, in an ideal world, selling a successful business for a chunk of money is a great idea. But you say, I got all sorts of quotes from you, only 20 to 25% of small businesses that go up for sale actually sell. What's that about?
Yeah, so this is a lot of what my work does, and in a lot of cases, small business owners have a somewhat inflated idea of what their business is worth. That's really a big problem, right? So if I, as the business owner, think it's worth $10 million because I've worked on it for 30 years and it's been my sweat and blood, but the market says it's only worth $1 million. Sometimes that's enough for the business owner to say, I forget it. I'm just going to shut it down. Like I can't make up that difference. Another big reason is that the business owner has not really structured it as a business. It's really more like a job. In other words, it's so ingrained in their being and their identity that they can't separate from the business. And that makes it unsaleable because a potential buyer coming in will look at it and say, it's really just you. There is no business here. It's just you as an employee that could have been very successful. But if you can't get independence from the business, then you can never harvest the value of it. And so that's a lot of what I do is helping that business owner get independence from their business and focus on the things that potential buyers value. So that's a big part of my work. That's things like really understanding your metrics of your business and documenting your processes so somebody else can come in and run it and getting backing away. The goal when I work with small business owners is that they can take vacations because they've set things up now that they can actually get away from it and that that they don't panic when they're not in the office. So that's a real goal of mine is a huge de-stressing from having that identity. So those are a couple of the reasons. One is just a real mismatch in the value of the company, and then that inability. So I work through clients basically a preparedness exercise where I look at about 40 different things, and there's a grade on each one of them. And those things tell you how ready that business is to transition. And just to give you a couple examples, do you have, does all your revenue come from only a couple customers? I mean, that's risky, right? So that's one of those things. If all of it comes from only a few, that's a negative, right? That increases the risk. Do you have pending lawsuits against your company? Do you have a management structure in place that other people can take over? So, those are just a couple of the things that I work through. But being better prepared on those things then significantly increases the likelihood that your business will actually sell.
The two thoughts that came to mind while you were talking there is, first of all, if I'm going to create my great business tomorrow, I should not call it Agnes Knowles Inc. I should call it, the Brilliant Boomer Woman Inc. because nobody wants to buy Agnes Knowles Inc. next year when I sell.
So branding is one of the 40 things we talk about.
Okay.
What's associated with your brand, and is that transferable?
Yeah, yeah. And then the other thing, and you've touched on it a couple of times, is stress release. And you compared it to life insurance. I can remember after my first child was born, my former husband and I sat down, we got all the insurance policies in place and everything else. And as soon as that guy walked out the door, it was just, I mean, the insurance guy walked out the door, it was like, oh man, the relief off your shoulders was just huge, because those things that come out of left field could come out of left field now, and everything was covered. So,
Right, right, and that's part of. I have some lots of stats,
I bet
but
you
but
do.
one of the other stats I have is that 50% of the businesses that transition happen involuntarily. So in other words, was not planned at all, right? And there are five big reasons. We call them the five Ds. They are death, disability, divorce, disagreements between partners, and distress. The pandemic being a great example of distress. Those are all things that can have a traumatic impact on a business. And even if you have the best exit plan in place, they're still bad. But not having a plan in place really can be traumatic. And this is something that I think your readers will, or your listeners and viewers will associate with. It's not just the business owner. It's the business owner, their family, their employees, their customers, and their community that's really impacted, right? I think about the small business owners in the community who they're the ones that are, donating to the high school hockey team. They're the ones that are, sponsoring the float in the parade. So they have a huge impact on the community that if one of those 5Ds happen and there is no plan, those things go away. And those are really, much more important than just the revenue that a business is generating. So that to me is the trauma. And I think when we lose small businesses, it has a much greater impact than just that, that one business owner no longer being around.
Okay, so you mentioned 5Ds. I had to jump ahead in my notes here because I have a sixth one for you. I had a
Okay.
career in elder care. Dementia can sneak up on a person, but
Hmm.
to the best of my knowledge, once someone has a diagnosis, they are not legally allowed to sign important documents. Do you have any insights there?
Yeah, I consider that a disability.
Oh,
Likely,
okay.
it's one of my Ds, but you can add it. I'll start talking about it now. Absolutely right, and that's why, you know, one of the challenges I have in my business is business owners I speak to say, of course this is important. Of course I need, it's important to have a plan, but it's not urgent, right? And so that's one of the things I kind of continue to remind them that one of those 5Ds can happen at any point. Whether you have a plan or not, they're going to happen. And you know, documenting that out in the case of in the case of disability like dementia, if you said, hey, if I'm incapacitated, this is what happens, you can do that while still of sound mind and body. And you know, rather than it's too late.
Hmm. Okay, so someone's listening and they say, man, if I could sell my business for a couple of $1 million, that would set me up for the rest of my days. You're walking into the office now. What do they need to make sure that a sale happens and that the dollar figure is substantial?
It really is business dependent, right? There are some businesses that again still may not sell for millions, but I'll go with your assumption. So I would reiterate, you need to be in the green on all 40 of my factors. I'm not going to go into all those. I'll give you the high points. Document your processes. So everything that happens needs to be written down. Or some of my clients now are doing videos instead. They're basically looking into the camera and say, in order to create an invoice, you do this, and then you do that, and then you do, so they're doing it in video rather than written form. Either is fine. But it's really so that somebody else can come in and run that business without you. That's a big piece. Really understanding what the key drivers of your business are is another piece. So you really understanding which customers are driving your revenue, which customers are driving your profit, because those may not be the same answer. And what I encourage and what I work with clients on is let's look at the profitability of of your customer segments. And what we typically find is that there is a segment or two of customers that may be generating a fair bit of revenue, but that they're losing money on. And so you have to sit there and say, either we fix that or we fire them as customers because a buyer cares less about revenue than they do about profitability. When a business is valued, there are several models. One is revenue, one is earnings, and much more commonly is earnings used as the measure of valuation of a company because you can generate a lot of revenue and lose money, right?
Yes.
So if you're making money and you have a high likelihood that those earnings are going to continue, the valuation of the company is just going to be much, much higher. So there's a whole piece about really focusing on the things that you're really good at. So that would be another word of advice. Stop doing the periphery stuff on the periphery. Figure out the things that your business is better at than anybody else and go hard on those, right? Focus on the things that nobody can do as well as you and get rid of the rest. It's because again, it's simplifying your life. It's going to be less stressful. Less customers isn't always bad, right? So that would be my advice. And the final word I would say is it's all about making progress. It's all about building momentum. So I would say to every business owner who's listening, pick 2 or 3 things that you can focus on in the next 90 days to improve in your business. Not 20 things, 2 or 3. Focus on those 2 or 3 things, and if you see, when you see progress, you'll want to do more, right? You'll want to go on to the next one. But if you try and do 10 or 20, you're never going to make enough progress to get excited about continuing. So that's my final word of advice on what should you do today or tomorrow when you go into the office.
Okay, and if I ever have this conversation with you again, I'll change it from selling for a couple of million to just even selling, because no, but seriously, selling, period, is going to be better than walking away in tears, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And look, it depends, right? There are, gold mine businesses out there that you wouldn't imagine, but there are some who appear very successful that literally can't be sold. So it really depends on the situation. But um, that's where I would focus my efforts.
I'm giving away my age here, but at one point in time, there was a price on goodwill. Is that still a factor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Intangible assets typically comprise about 80% of the
Oh,
valuation of a company. And when I say goodwill, I mean things like um, the social capital within your company, the culture, right? What are the things that culturally you do that's ingrained? The customer capital, which is the things like, do you have a broad customer base? Do they pay you every month? So recurring revenue is highly valued, right? Systematic capital, right? Do you have everything that your processes documented? So fully 80% of the value of the company is typically not something you can see from the outside. The things you can see from the outside are things like how robust is the industry? What's the company's standing within the industry? Those are things you can gauge from the outside, but they comprise typically only about 20% of the value.
hmm. You touched on this.
Does that surprise you? Does that surprise you that it's that high?
Yeah, yeah, it did. That's great. Now, oh, you touched on this briefly. If someone spent their entire adult life growing this one business, emotion enters the picture. How does Len, the advisor, deal with the emotion? I mean, you got to be careful in what you say.
I do. One of the toughest things, one of the toughest parts of the process is actually doing a professional business valuation because it's just seldom does the valuation come out to what the business owner was expecting. It's almost always lower, right? So that is a good news, bad news, right? So the bad news is your business isn't worth today what you thought it was worth. The good news, if you think about what I work with clients on, is over time, you can increase that value, right? So you can focus on those areas that external parties value. And so you can make significant increases in that. And the way businesses are typically valued in this small business space is a multiple of earnings effectively. So your profits times a multiple. And in a lot of cases, the businesses that I'm working with are in the 3 to 4 times earnings multiple.
Yeah.
The idea, though, is that if you can get this thing really tuned up, if you get that to 5 or 6 times, it has a significant impact on the overall value of the company. That's typically how businesses are valued, and so that's why I can if you just imagine that if you took the same profit, let's just say it's $1 million, and you were at a multiple of 3 versus a multiple of 5, it's a difference of $2 million, right? On generating no more profit. It's just because all those other intangible things are more valuable that you get that higher multiple.
Hmm. Okay, I got to stick with emotion for just a moment.
Okay.
Um, we've all seen the movie. Parent builds the business. Child assumes they'll take over. And I'm talking an adult child here. Parent doesn't think they're going to do a good job, and or parent wants the money out of the business. Have you dealt with any of that?
Yes, but the inverse is actually more common.
Oh, okay.
The inverse is that about half of the parent, I'll just keep it parent child at this point, about half of the parents think that their child is going to take it over, and only about 20% of the children have any interest at all. So that is actually the bigger issue. And that stems from just a lack of communication, right? It's literally they need to talk and they don't, right? So going back to your scenario, it's tricky, right? So the conversation with the owner, with the parent at that point is your child not ready today, or do you believe your child is will never be ready, right? So two different answers. If it's not today, then it's like, okay, let's put a plan in place to get the child ready. Let's get them training, let's get them experience, whatever that might be. So that's the way to solve that one. The the other scenario that you talked about, which is child thinking they're just going to give it to me, that again is just it's a communication, right? The parent has to be forthright and say, I built this thing, and you know what? I'm going to get the value out of it. If you want to take it over, you go out and get that loan that we talked about earlier, or we can bring in another investor or whatever, but I'm not just giving it to you. And because a lot of times there are equity issues with other children who are not going to be taking over the business, right? So those that's less, that's less me. um, but the conversation has to happen. And there are kind of family transition people that help in that area that will get the whole family to sit down together and, break bread, or I don't know what they do, but it really just comes down to the parents saying, these are my goals. And, you know, because I have the keys right now, what I say goes. How do we let's resolve this?
That might be a good segue into a question I did want to ask. We're talking smallish businesses here. Who needs to be a part of the legalities? In case I start the exit planning, but tomorrow I get hit by the proverbial bus, who legally completes the planning and the deal?
Yeah, so there are a handful of players, and each of them plays a part typically at different points in the process. And remember, I think about exit planning not as a an event, but as a process, or a process, as you would say. In very very early on, uh, there can be a kind of a life coach, transition coach involved, which is, what am I going to do after, right? 'Cause this is super important to have that plan for what you're going to do after. Also, very early on in the process is a financial planner, wealth planner, estate planner. Okay. Get the financial house in order. And part of what one of the early pieces is to look at what's called the wealth gap. So a business owner has this much in personal assets, but to retire, let's say they want this much. And really the only way to make up that difference is with the value of the business, right? You can invest all you want for 5 years. You're probably not going to narrow that gap. So that's why the value of the business is the part that can really move the needle. But having a good idea of where the owner is financially and where they want to go is huge. So that's the life coach, that's the financial planner, certainly a business attorney, especially if there are partners in the business. There needs to be buy-sell agreement that deals with what happens if one leaves, is incapacitated, whatever, they're legal. And those are typically covered with insurance, which will buy out the other partner. So business attorney and then kind of a state attorney as well. Those are typically the early getting going pieces, as well as potentially a coach, right? Who's going to work on the value piece of it. Later on, there can be, and there also can be insurance, financial services on the insurance side as well early on. As you move down, it really depends. A lot of the clients I'm working with aren't doing the I'm just going to sit back and wait for these next 5 years, but they're saying, I want to close that wealth gap. And so they may be going out and raising money. They may need to get money from a bank to do marketing campaigns or to expand their production lines or things like that. So bankers come into play, and then potentially, marketing and other e-commerce people and, whatever to drive the business. And then as you get further down the road, you end up ultimately engaging with a business broker or an M&A advisor to actually sell the business. And all along that way, there are financial services people typically involved, as well as lawyers and accountants. I missed accountants early on. Accountant is a key partner. Many times, the accountant that you're using to run your business isn't really the right person to get your business ready for sale, right? So it can be a change of accountants along the way.
I'm just going to throw this out there. Is a tax accountant the same thing as your view of an accountant, or is that yet another person?
It can be the same, but what you really need, you really need somebody that is going to get your books in order, so your
Mm.
actual accounting records, right? Because any buyer is going to want to see at least 3 years worth of, they don't need to be audited financials, but they need to be reviewed typically. So that's a CPA. You definitely, with that, estate planning is typically a tax attorney as well, because what you try to do is structure all of your assets to be as tax advantaged as possible. So it can be the same, could be a different type of accountant.
I'm going to give you another scenario here, and it's probably the only transition that I know personally. Was a long-term business owner with a fairly unusual business. It would take a special person to take it over. I did find that special person, and the longtime owner stayed on with the new young person and
Mhm.
just coached them, was back up, just until that younger person was confident taking over running the business. And then the long-term employee or the long-term owners just said, I'm hopping a jet plane. And it's worked for both of them.
That's a beautiful scenario. I wish it happened all the time. It typically doesn't, right? So a lot of the ways that there are two schools of thought, right? Some owners really still want to be involved, and that's great. Some of them need to be involved because in many cases, a buyer will come in and they'll say, I'll pay you 75% of the total price, but the other 25% you don't is an earnout. You get that over time as if you continue to work in the business, right? And hit certain goals. So those are called earnouts. Business owners, the old business owners tend not to like those, and it's one that the new owner can change the rules about what the goals are. The bigger issue for the old business owner is more like they don't want to take direction. They don't like not being the boss, right? So that's a great scenario that you described. That's a beautiful case. Um, there can be situations though where it doesn't end up that way. And then there are other situations where, the owner says, I'm out. Here are the keys, don't call me.
Yes, I can see the
But no,
advantages to
that's
that one.
yeah, but I get it. And again, this all comes into the negotiation of the price, right? So as the old owner may want that income. I may want some steady income for a couple of years. So I may say, hey, I'll sign up for 2 more years. And it's great if they can, if they can divest themselves and say, it's not my business anymore, and I'm just an employee, all good.
Suddenly working a 9 to 5 instead of a 8 to midnight.
Yeah, but I'm sure, but the pang is though I wouldn't have done it that way, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So there are trade-offs, but it definitely is less stressful, right? Because it's not your worry to make payroll anymore. It's somebody else's problem.
And you're on that payroll. Um, Now, once again, you've touched on these things, but I'm going to go specifically to pitfalls because you talk about pitfalls. What are some of the pitfalls to avoid when you're thinking about selling your business?
Yeah, so this gets into, my list of 40. But some of the biggest ones are really what I've touched on is not not having anything documented. Having bad financial statements can be a real killer. Some business owners will treat their company almost like their personal, you know, personal funding. The
Yeah.
vacation homes, the expensive cars, those don't sit well typically with potential buyers in some ways, just from a trust factor. But in other ways, they're actually really positive because the new owner says we're not going to have any of those. So that money is going to come to profits rather than going, on these frivolous things. So, bad accounting records is a killer. Just being a laggard in the industry. So if you are at the lower end of your grouping in your industry, if you're not the one leading, if you're the one always following, that's going to be a huge pitfall, right? Another one would be just having bad culture. This gets back to those goodwill things. If people are leaving, um, if you've got a drain on your talented people, that's going to be a huge red flag. So, a number of things. The concentration of customers is another bad one. Lawsuits hanging out there is another bad one. So, there are all things that you can clean up over time, but it really gets to how ready your business is today. So, almost everything is solvable with enough time. But if you came in today and said, I was going to sell this business tomorrow, that checklist would be where you'd see the pitfalls.
I'm going to put you on the spot here, and all you need to say is yes or no. Have you ever walked into a potential advisor placement, gotten into it a little bit, and said, "No, I'm out of here"? It could,
Yes.
yeah, it could be
Yes.
personality. It could be anything. I mean, it's.
Right.
Okay.
And the good news is it's my choice to take on a client as much as it's the client's choice to hire me. So I always have that right. But I have had a situation where pretty quickly I just said this is not going to work out, not even long term, even short term. So yes, I have. And look, it's better to just
Mhm.
admit that up front and move on.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, no, I'm all over that. Um, we've touched a whole bunch of subjects here. Obviously, we don't want you to give your entire business away. Is there anything we haven't discussed that you think sort of boomer age business owners should think about?
Um, Let me think for a second. I'd like to tell a bad story, uh, kind of maybe a wake up call. So this is a real life story, not a client of mine, but a friend of mine's father. And he had run a successful law practice for about 15 years, very successful, and unfortunately got ill and died, and did not have any kind of planning for his business. So his family was kind of left to pick up the pieces, and they didn't know who owed the business money. They didn't know who the business owed money. They didn't have a password to get into any of the systems. The bookkeeper they had been using had not been doing their job. Taxes hadn't been filed for several years.
Wow.
It was an absolute disaster. So this company, or the family, actually had to spend about $75,000 to just clean up the mess. They had to hire forensic accountants. They had to hire lawyers, and all that came out of the estate. Um, and it was because, you know, the lawyer, the sole practitioner lawyer, just didn't think this was important, right? And so it really left a mess again for his family, for the clients, for the community. It's just, I hate to tell the story because it's a sad story, but it is a little bit sobering, I think, to of what can happen if you don't think about this. And it's not meant to scare anybody, but it is, I think, a real life story of the ramifications of not thinking about what happens to your business.
Well, and where my thoughts went there was, you know, you've just lost your parent, your spouse, your child, whatever. And on top of all of that grief, now you've got to do the legal thing, the all that stuff. Like it's just a hornet's nest on top of tragedy.
Yes,
So,
yes. So nothing happy out of it, right? I mean,
yeah.
and it wouldn't. So one thing I'll say, the one topic I'd like to touch on is a, a big reason that business owners don't take this on is they think it's complicated and expensive, and they don't have time for it. Those are all obviously valid concerns. But when you think about the ramifications for not doing it, um, it ends up not being so expensive or confusing. Or there are people that can help. There are people who are experts in each of these fields, as I talked about, and they can help you. You don't have to do it all at once, but you need to get started. So that's that's where I come out on this is, you know, it is tough to do. If you were to say, oh, I'm going to hire the accountant, the lawyer, and then all at once, it would be daunting. So the, you know, you can start to pick and choose and make progress on each category. It will be a huge stress reliever for the business owner. That's what I look at as the brightest spot out of this is having that plan will let you sleep at night.
Well, and you mentioned your friend's parent who got sick. You know, did the family, and this is just a, like, I'm thinking out loud, I'm not asking you a question, but did the family have any clue that he was so unprepared for death, you know, as they went through that, you know? So they would also have had that huge relief off of their shoulders if he had come home a couple of years earlier and said, guess what? I've been working with Len for the last year and I couldn't get hit by the bus tomorrow and you guys are fine and everything's fine.
Yeah, I'll answer. They had no idea. They thought things were fine because, you know, he was the firm was successful. He was making money, but they just didn't know all the underpinnings. So it was quite a shock and a fairly unpleasant one, as you can imagine.
Okay, you are a certified exit planning advisor. You you get the phone call. What happens next? What do you do, in other
So,
words?
right. So the first thing I do is my process is to have a pretty short conversation and just understand what the business is. So tell me about your business. Tell me about, you know, what are your plans? How far out are you thinking? You know, what's your transition timeline? And I just really learn some more about their business. And I try to get to what's your biggest stressor, right? Because at my core, I'm also a business coach, right? So the stressor may not be the exit plan. The stressor may be, I want to grow my business faster. You know, how do I do that, right? So it's really let me get an understanding of your business. And then typically that's a follow-up. There's a follow-up call to get in deeper to each of those kind of pain points, and followed then by a real business review, which is here's the way I see things, and here's the areas that I could help you with. And at any point in time, a person can say, doesn't feel like a fit. That's great. We move. We part ways. If they say, yeah, this is something I need help with, one of those first things I'm going to do is get a valuation of their business done. And again, it's just a level setting. This gives us now a point to work from. So there's a point A. Now let's work toward point B. And it's a relatively well-defined process that can veer as the client needs it, right? So if the client has something really pressing, I'll help you with that this week, right? And then next week we'll get back to the other pieces. But it gets to, the next steps of the understanding the metrics and documenting the processes and starting to think about who's going to take over, and just each of those steps in 30, 60, 90-day increments. So we don't say we're going to solve 3 years from now problem. We're going to work on what's pressing in the next 30 days, make progress on that, move on.
As you were describing that, I was thinking you did a really good job of, if I was that business owner now listening to you, I'd go like, oh man, yeah, I can do that. It's not as momentous as my procrastination has made it seem. So thank you for that. It just, you really sort of clarified that no, it's one step at a time, and you get to the
Yeah.
end of the race. So, where do we find you on the World Wide Web?
You can find me at greaterheightscoaching.com, which is my website. So greater heights, like the heights of a building, coaching.com.
Okay, I was going to go with the mountain, but we can go with the building. And your social seems to be LinkedIn and X. Is that correct?
Predominantly LinkedIn.
Okay.
Yeah, that's where I'm most active.
Okay. May I ask you a personal question before we close?
Sure.
Okay. Boston. I was there a few decades ago and I loved it. But in the last month and a half, I seem to be interviewing a lot of people from Boston. And they live there, but they are, shall we say, less than thrilled. Are you with Boston? Are you a Boston yay or a Boston meh person?
So, interest of full disclosure, I don't live in the city. I'm in a suburb.
Yeah,
So,
that's it.
my experience is probably different. Um, I'm look, Boston has its problems. The public transit system is broken. Um, there are issues facing the city, but I still think I'm still a yay. It's still just a great place. There's so much to do. It's one of the few walking cities in America, where you can get around to almost everything on foot. So I'm still a big yay, but I admit that there are issues that the city and the state are dealing with.
Okay, if I phone you tomorrow and say, Len, I'm flying into Boston on the weekend, what should I see? What's your answer? Where should I go? What should I see? Either one.
What do you like to do?
Oh man, no, just give me your favorite.
All right, so I would go. Uh, I would go probably to one of the museums, either the MFA, Museum of Fine Arts, or I would go to the New England Aquarium, which is really fun. I would also walk. The first thing I would do is walk the Freedom Trail. So that takes you past all of the main historical sites in Boston. That would be my first thing to do. And then I would have great seafood someplace, and there are 1,000 places. But if you don't like seafood, then I would tell you to go to the North End, and it's the best Italian food. So that would be my weekend.
There you-
Freedom Trail, some great restaurants.
Okay, there you go. So now everybody that's listening, you can actually go to Boston, have a really good time, and hire Len at the same time.
Doesn't matter where you are, you can hire me.
Okay, I guess I should have asked that question. So you can work virtually then, can you?
Yes, anywhere in really anywhere in the world, but I'm focused on North America because again, I'm not an attorney.
Mhm.
It's not state specific or province specific for what I do.
Oh, okay. That's good to know because so many things with business and legalities and like all that stuff is you're in your state or your province basically, and you don't even go outside those borders. But your exit planning can be a little bit more universal.
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, it's not I'm not dealing with accounting law or business law for a particular state. This is more general business understanding, which is not geographically specific.
Okay. Your website link is in the show notes, and there'll be a couple more links on your page at our website. Listeners, if you're a small business owner, I hope we've given you something to think about. I'd appreciate it if you'd share a few thoughts wherever you're listening. If you're listening at the Boomer Woman's podcast at boomwithabang.com, scroll to the bottom of the page and talk to us there. Maybe there's a question I didn't ask Len. Ask it in the comments and I'll get you an answer. Leave stars and reviews where you can. You help us grow our reach when you do that. And share this episode. Many of us know someone who owns a small business. You'll be doing both them and their loved ones a huge favor if they're part of the 50% who don't have an exit plan, strategy yet. Len Bruskiewitz, thank you for being my guest today and giving the business owners amongst us so much to chew on.
Great. I appreciate you asking. It was a pleasure.
Have a great rest of the week.
All right. You too.